Hello and welcome to the Greater Houston Partnership Houston Business Forum series on COVID-19. We're going to let everyone have just a moment to enter, and then we'll run through a couple of our quick introductions before we begin the program. All right, well, we're going to let everyone go ahead and continue to join us, but just to start some initial remarks for you and get us on track today. Thank you again for joining us for our business forum. We have our resources page up right now, so if you'd like to take a screenshot, or this will be available as all of our video webinars are for viewing later, as we will be recording this session, and you can find our recorded past sessions and current this one on houston.org/coronavirus. So please do visit us on that site for more information. Last week, we held our member address with Bob Harvey, our president and CEO, and walked through the Governor Abbott's recent Open Texas order and what it meant for Houston businesses. So during that discussion, we shared the partnership's work safe principles, and I'll pull those up for everyone to take a look at right now. And this is actually our 2.0 principles. This will also be available for you in the recording post-event, but also exists on our website at houston.org/coronavirus or /worksafe, and you can access those. Note that we're kind of following very much the Open Texas order, and we did clarify that office workers should still work remotely if possible, but clearly there is no one-size-fits-all. I'll be bringing these principles back up at the end of the program, so you'll have a chance to jot them down or take another screenshot. As we cautiously move through these reopening phases, the partnership will continue to work with our business community to ensure a safe transition, which will involve a multifaceted approach. Find all of our resources on our website, and that includes a growing list of resources around supplies. We do know that by making these announcements, we recognize that our companies want to get back to work. And so we are encouraging, we put a call out to our businesses to post any supplies that they have available, including masks, hand sanitizers, as well as cleaning supplies. So those are all on our Greater Houston Partnership LinkedIn page. And I was on there this morning, so I know for a fact that we do have some postings related to that content. So please do visit us there to get more information. Today's program, we're going to be talking about returning to work, and that includes guidance for our small and medium-sized employers around legal, human resource, and tax financial considerations. So kind of think of this as part of your business continuity planning. And as each situation and company is different in terms of their restart efforts, the partnership does advise that you can consult your own legal, HR, or tax representatives for specific scenarios. So we are providing general guidelines in today's presentation. This will not necessarily can be used and construed as legal advice. Take note of our State of Houston's Global Economy that will be coming up on May 27th. This is a virtual event. We will be streaming it from our website. I want to thank Mitsubishi Corporation Americas for their generous support as our presenting sponsor, and Patrick Jankowski, who you may all be familiar with his bi-weekly economic updates, will be presenting the Global Houston Report and analysis. He's also going to be followed by a fireside chat with the chair of Albright Stonebridge Group and former U.S. Secretary of Commerce, Carlos Gutierrez. That will all be on May 27th, and you can register now if you go to our website at houston.org events. Now I want to go ahead and introduce all of our panelists today. We have a wonderful group of panelists, and we appreciate so much their time. I'll read each of their bios, and then we'll start with Professor Newman. So Frank Landreneau is Chief Financial Officer and Director of International Tax for PKF Texas. Frank has extensive background and experience in domestic and international tax consulting and compliance. services to private and public entities based in the US and around the world. His experience includes assisting clients operating in various tax jurisdictions with a variety of international tax issues such as transfer pricing, global tax minimization, and international organizational structuring. While he's been at PKF, Frank has become the outsourced solution for international tax services for offices within our global network affiliations. And his areas of focus are on repatriation, outbound planning involving foreign holding company structures. Professor Newman, Neal Newman, is a professor of law at Texas A&M University School of Law, and he has been there since 2013. Originally a graduate from the University of Michigan's Ross School of Business, Professor Newman practices as a certified public accountant in the state of Michigan. And he went back to law school, attending Howard University School of Law, and started his law career as a transactional lawyer at the law firm of Alston and Bird in Atlanta, Georgia. Professor Newman brings practical experience and knowledge into the classroom, making skills-based learning an integral part of his class discourse. He also consults with small businesses, provides legal, tax, and accounting advice to help them navigate their way through compliance. Thank you so much, Professor Newman, for being with us. And then finally, Jeff Sorrells, Senior Human Resource Specialist with Insperity. Jeff has actually been featured on one of our webinars recently, so we thank and welcome him back. He is a native Houstonian and a University of Houston graduate in business administration. He has 29 years of human resource experience, 18 years as Senior Human Resource Specialist with Insperity. And he focuses on employee relations, liability management, and HR infrastructure. So prior to Insperity, he worked in the healthcare, manufacturing, and security of commercial buildings industries as a human resource professional. And again, he's been an invited guest for the partnerships webinars and specifically on the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. So at this time, we'd like to bring up Professor Newman. Neal, let's go ahead and get started with your presentation. I will remind our audience that you can use our chat feature at the bottom or top of your screen if you have any technical issues related to the program, and or if you are interested in providing a question to one of our speakers, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to ask questions throughout the program. So now I will turn things over to Professor Newman. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carrie. Thanks for having me. It's always, okay. Always great when the navigation is working. Let me just make sure everything is set up. Okay. Okay, appreciate you all's patience. Thanks for having me, Carrie, and it's great to be here. I know this is an exciting and uncertain time, just very unusual times we're in. So to the extent we can kind of help with this transition back to reopening the businesses. So just getting right to it, I'm going to talk briefly and give an overview about the Paycheck Protection Program. I know we've been several weeks into the program, but there still may be some that are still getting familiar with it. And then I'm going to talk about some big picture issues in terms of sort of where, there have been some issues with the Paycheck Protection Program that have caused some concern about the money going to bigger companies versus smaller. And so I want to address those issues just to make sure that here in the greater Houston area, we're just aware of those issues so that we can make sure we properly navigate around them. And then Frank is going to follow my presentation and get a little bit more granular about certain compliance issues. So let me get right into it. So what I'm going to talk about, just my coverage, I'm going to first give an overview of how the Paycheck Protection Program works, and then talk about how it's structured, and talk about how the loan amount is calculated. And then this is the part that's coming up lately, making sure your business properly qualifies for a PPP loan. I think that's a big issue nowadays. And does your business really need this money? I know all businesses are saying, I absolutely need this money, but we're talking about as far as the Treasury concerned, and I'll get more into that when I get to that juncture. And then finally, I'm going to conclude about how to make sure your business is compliant. So just big picture overview about how the Paycheck Protection Program works. there have been some $670 billion earmarked and approved for small business, these small business quote unquote loans. The government has guaranteed these loans up to $10 million per business. And generally speaking, to qualify for these loans are businesses that have 500 employees or less. There's some exceptions and caveats to that, but that's the general guideline. And the idea is that this money was to cover payroll and payroll-related expenses. The idea was to keep people employed and keep people on the payroll. So the covered period is February 15th through June 30th, 2020. That's theoretically the time in which you can apply for one of these PPP loans, although the money will more than likely be depleted by that time. And the big key is the loans are forgiven if the business uses money to cover payroll and payroll-related expenses. And Frank is going to give you a little bit more detail on that when he's following my presentation. So this is the big picture on how the Paycheck Protection Program works. When we look at how the program is structured, all this money is federally backed. The loans are being facilitated through the Small Business Administration. The money is actually being dispersed through SBA lender financial institutions. And the general terms of the loans, if they aren't forgiven, it's up to $10 million and it's a 1% maximum interest rate. So fairly favorable loan terms regardless. And again, we're talking about 500 or fewer employees as a general rule. How is this loan amount calculated? Again, generally what we're doing here is we're taking 2.5 times the company's average monthly payroll cost during the prior 12 months. Like how much were you paying per month on average? You take that, multiply it by 2.5, and that's generally the amount that you qualify for in terms of a loan. Again, the loans are capped at $10 million per business. So here's where we kind of get into making sure your business properly qualifies. So like I said, generally we're talking about 500 or fewer employees, but there are other bases upon which a small business can qualify. There's a net worth test. If your net worth is less than $15 million, or your company's net income is less than $5 million. And additionally, the SBA has size based on industry standards. So depending on your business and those guidelines, you may also qualify. But in addition, you have to consider what they call the affiliation rules, and they can get complex and layered. But the general idea is if you are affiliated with another business, then you have to calculate the number of employees and the financial aspects of that affiliated business as well. So whether you qualify will be considered in the aggregate. And how you're affiliated, it could be based on voting control, whether that entity has a 51% ownership, whether they have management control, or whether the business is income dependent on another business. So any of these criteria can result in your business being affiliated with another business. And if that's the case, then you have to consider that entity in the aggregate as to whether you qualify for a small business loan. So you have to keep that in mind. Now, does your business really need this money? I know small businesses like, absolutely, we need this money. I understand that. So we're talking about this in court according to the Treasury. And just to give you all quick context, there's been a lot of situations out there where a lot of publicly traded companies, a lot of larger companies have been getting a hold of this money. And that's caused a lot of controversy if you've been watching the news. Just recently, the LA Lakers, they got a hold of this PPP money. Fortunately, they've given it back after it was brought to light. The LA Lakers is currently worth about $4.4 billion. So I don't think they were one of the entities intended to receive this money. So that's kind of the backdrop. So in light of that, what we need to be aware of is, some of you may have already received this money. Some of you may already have this money, or you may be in the process of waiting for disbursement, things along those lines. So assuming that's the case, these are some things that I want you to make sure you keep in mind. when you fill out that application, there are a number of certifications on that application, one of which says current economic uncertainty makes this loan request necessary to support ongoing operations of the applicant. Well, the Treasurer and the SBA are giving this a lot more scrutiny. So the idea is they don't want companies who don't need the money trying to access the money. They want folks who actually really need the money. Now, to be clear, that's a very, that's a very undefined term. So just something to keep in mind. And you're also certifying that the funds will be used to retain workers and maintain payroll and mortgage payments. And that you're also certifying that the applicant will provide documentation verifying number of employees, payroll costs for the 8-week period following the loan. Okay, and Frank, I think, is going to talk a little bit more about the documentation and so forth. So keep this in mind, okay? And this is why I'm stressing this. The SBA and the Treasury, they have said that they will audit loans greater than $2 million. I think it's more of a threat. When you look at the numbers of $2 million loans or more, there's quite a few. It's kind of like the IRS when they threaten to audit your tax return. It's the same kind. Most will not be audited, but you don't want to be that one or two or whatever that gets audited if you're not in compliance. And another thing, public companies, if you are a publicly traded company and you're applying for these loans, you will be under more scrutiny because there is a presumption by the SBA and the Treasury that you are in a financial position to access other sources, such as the public market. So you have to be aware of that. And any company that's questionable in terms of whether they qualify, the SBA and the Treasury say you can give this money back by May 7th, no questions asked, no problem, no issue. So it's something to keep in mind. And my final slide before I conclude, as you go through and if you're receiving this money and you're going to be using this money and so forth, what you need to do is you need to assume that more than likely that post-loan, it may come under scrutiny. It probably won't happen, but you want to prepare for that eventuality. So in that regard, you want to document everything. You want to keep meticulous records. You want to be thoughtful about changes in employee counts because that is factored in as to what amount of the loan is going to be forgiven. And you want to be thoughtful about any changes in pay over the next 8 weeks after you receive this money, because all of these have bearings on the amount for which you will be allowed in terms of forgiveness. So you want to have documentation and records for all of this material. And just to keep in mind, the period that will be under scrutiny will be the 8 weeks following the receipt of this money, all right? That's the period that would be in question. After that, you can do whatever you want in terms of employee and pay, but the 8 weeks after you receive the money is the period that's going to be under scrutiny. And finally, as I conclude, everything that I'm talking about here, you can find information just going to sba.gov. And anything I talk about, you want more detail on, you want to see some written documentation on, you can more than likely find it at sba.gov. So I will stop here and I will pass it on. Thank you all for attending today.
Great. Thanks, Neal. Appreciate that. Questions can be logged in on the Q&A tab if you have any for Neal or any of the speakers, and we'll be taking those at the end of the program. So now we'll go ahead and continue on, and I next want to invite our next speaker, which is Frank Landreneau, and we'll be talking a little bit more about PPP, and now that you have it, what comes next? Frank?
Thanks, Carrie, and thanks, Professor Newman. That was a great introduction to what people have been asking about this PPP loan and questions about funding and so forth. So with that, I'll go to my next slide and start going into the next part. Professor Newman gave a great introduction. You got your PPP loan, you've gone through the hurdles, you've gone through the SBA waiting line. Now what? At the beginning of the period, so there's different types of periods, but once you have your loan, you record it for financial and tax accounting purposes as a regular loan with an interest rate of 1% maximum, as Professor Newman discussed, until forgiven. And as we previously mentioned, there's an 8-week period starting on the date of the origination of the loan, and we're using terms from the CARES Act, and that there's been a little bit of confusion around what date that is, and it's really the date when the loan is funded, not really when the documents are signed or anything like that. It's when the loan is funded is when the 8-week period begins, and that's the testing period where you have to use your funds. If you want loan forgiveness, which that's really kind of the plan, you have to use it for these qualified purposes, and we'll get into that specifically in a minute. Separate bank account tracking is helpful but not required. So, you know, what's helpful is to have a separate new bank account to track the funds, but it's not a requirement of the SBA or this loan program. But it can be helpful with the documentation that Professor Newman alluded to. Retaining documentation to support all payments with the Paycheck Protection Program funds. And also another best practices tip, although not a requirement, is to set up a separate account code within your general ledger to capture these amounts. Next. So I guess the real question becomes, this is where there's guidance out there. I think there will be more guidance as we continue on during this period. But the question becomes, how can these Paycheck Protection Program funds be used? Talk about payroll costs, but what specifically? It could be used for employee vacation, parental, family, medical, and sick leave. At one point in the process, particularly as we're helping clients prepare for their loan applications, there was confusion about, payroll costs are defined similarly for purposes of determining your maximum loan amount as well as for the debt forgiveness. And payroll costs include employee compensation, but not in excess of $100,000. There was initially some confusion about, do you not include any amount for an employee who makes over $100,000? And the answer is no. It's up to that $100,000 amount. So you can include the employee that makes in excess of $100,000, but you cannot include that employee's compensation above that amount. Another point that was later clarified but not initially clear was whether this $100,000 exclusion was a total compensation exclusion or limit. And the answer to that is no. For those types of employees, you can include cash benefits, would include their retirement plans, employee healthcare benefits, including insurance premiums. Amounts that are not included is 1099 amounts paid to independent contractors. It does not include the employer portion of the FICA taxes, which is the 6.2, currently it's 6.2% of employees' wages, and that is capped at $137,700 for the 2020 year, but it does include state and local taxes on compensation. And then finally, very important point, because this is a payroll protection program, at least 75% of the PPP funds must be used for payroll costs. A lot of different things to keep in mind is that, if you are typically not, during this cycle, not accustomed to making certain bonus payments, and you do make bonus payments during this period, that would probably be something that you would not want to do, because that would be scrutinized as something irregular, an irregular pattern for you. So keep in mind, we want, I think the Congress and the SBA are looking for normal patterns during a payroll cycle. Okay, on my next slide, we talk a little bit about other payments that are not necessarily attributable to payroll. You can use these funds, but of course no more than 25% can be used for interest payments on existing mortgage obligations, rent payments for real property, or equipment leases. I think there'll be more guidance on the equipment leases coming forward that existed prior to February 15th of 2020. Utility payments, which does include things like telephone and internet access, that for which service began prior to February 15th, and then interest on other debt obligations that were incurred prior to February 15th. Some questions that come up, or can you prepay rent amounts? And the general consensus is that no, it's really amounts that are incurred and paid during this period, although I think there could be some further guidance on some of these particular items before it's all said and done. So next slide. So this is really what everyone is probably worried about and concerned about. And Neal, Professor Newman gave us a great segue into that. The application for loan forgiveness, although not specifically stated, it's generally considered that that borrowers will make their application for loan forgiveness with their local bank through the SBA, through their local banking institution, really right after the 8-week period, the period from the time you get the loan initially funded, and then the 8 weeks period following that. There's no specific deadline to apply, but it's generally considered that most borrowers would apply shortly thereafter. Loan forgiveness is really applicable to the PPP loan funds that were spent on what I call qualified expenditures. That's not a defined term, but we talked about that in previous slides, that during the 8-week period. There are limits on loan forgiveness, which basically says it obviously cannot exceed the principal amount of the loan. That's probably pretty obvious. What may not be obvious is that the loan forgiveness amount is reduced for a reduction in total wages during the covered period, that if you have amounts of wages that are less than 25% of the total salary you had in the previous full quarter in which the employees were employed prior to the covered period. Again, they're looking to make sure you're maintaining your workforce, and so you can't have cuts in salaries of people or reductions for more than 25% of salary prior to the full quarter prior to the covered period. And there is a fraction or a ratio based on the reduction of a number of employees, and we'll go into that in the next slide. So next, this is probably the very, very important point of the loan forgiveness. So you have your loan expenditures that we've been talking about, the payroll costs, the interest, the interest on mortgage, the rents, etc. And the question becomes, is it 100% of that, or is there a factor? And the answer is there is a factor. This reduction factor, there's a quotient or a ratio that is used. The numerator of that ratio is the amount of full-time equivalents during that 8-week period, as compared to a reference period, which is your denominator in the quotient. The denominator, you get a choice of 2 base periods: the period from February 15th, 2019 through June 30th, 2019, or a reference period or base period from January 1 through February 29th, 2020. And so you calculate the full-time employee equivalents. So it's not anticipated that this is going to be an integer. This could be, a decimal by the time it's over, with employees coming and leaving just through natural attrition. It makes mathematical sense that you would choose the lower of the 2 reference periods, because you'd want the denominator of the quotient to be the lower the amount, therefore increasing the ratio. The PPP full-time equivalent employees deals with again, full-time equivalents, not necessarily specific employees. And a recent addition to the FAQs, or frequently asked questions, to the SBA website is, will an employer be penalized in the loan forgiveness calculation if an employee is laid off, that employee receives an offer to be rehired, but the employee declined the offer? And the answer in the FAQ is no. That will not penalize employers. So next, on the slide we have, so the big question is addressing Dr. Newman's statements, which I totally agree with, on the audit. It's got a lot of folks, I know a lot of my clients concerned. Most people that I believe are looking at these loans have loans. You don't have to be a large company to have a loan amount of over $2 million. So the key is documentation, and that shouldn't be very hard to come by. With the IRS, and this is in the CARES Act, so it's not something that is nebulous to most folks, is the payroll tax filings reported for the IRS during that period, state and local unemployment insurance filings, canceled checks, receipts, etc. For really, it's more applicable for the other expenditures that we've talked about relating to mortgage obligations, covered leases, and utility payments. And then there's a certification that must be made that this documentation is correct and forgiveness was used, or forgiveness of the loan is requested, is to retain employees, make interest, and other necessary business payments. And then we probably haven't seen the rest of the story yet, as the SBA may have additional guidance before it's all said and done with respect to additional documentation. Okay, so moving along, next slide. So this process is, you do apply, you have your documentation, you submit your loan forgiveness application to your lender, which is going to be reviewed and then submitted to SBA for its review and approval. And by statute of the CARES Act, this is part of the CARES Act law, you're required to receive a decision within 60 days of submitting the loan forgiveness application. Assuming, and this is what most taxpayers are really counting on, is that there will be this forgiveness. How is that treated for tax and financial accounting purposes? For financial accounting purposes, it's not really income from operations, so the loan forgiveness, which is the debt relief income, would be classified as other income. And the loan forgiveness is specifically not included in taxable income under the CARES Act. So that amount, that specific fact is not in dispute. What's rather interesting and will be somewhat fluid in the weeks to come is last week, I believe it was last Thursday or Friday, the Internal Revenue Service has come out with Notice 2020-32, which addresses a debate that's had been out there in the tax community, is whether amounts paid for, expenditures that are paid for through PPP funds, for example, the payroll costs, wages, salaries, interest, utility expenses, etc., are those amounts deductible for tax purposes, thereby giving somewhat of a benefit in two regards. One is the loan forgiveness, and then the expenditures that are otherwise typically ordinarily deductible, would they not be deducted in this case? This IRS notice basically says that these expenditures would be aggregated and classified as being attributable to a type of tax-exempt income, and therefore not deductible under existing code sections and regulations. In a response to that, remarkably and favorably, a response has been given through bipartisan efforts, both through the top tax writers, on both sides of the aisle. Senator Grassley has commented that this is not the intent of Congress. This is the whole idea of the PPP funding, is to provide liquidity and to provide this type of so-called double benefit. And on the Democratic side, tax writer has also commented that in the next regulation package, which is set forth to be forthcoming now that the Senate has reconvened to fix this. Although last night, our Treasury Secretary Munchin had mentioned that he supports the IRS's view. I imagine if Congress is favorable in looking at correcting this, it should be corrected. But this is definitely something that the tax community and borrowers of PPP loans should be watchful of, as this is definitely what this was meant to do, is to provide liquidity. Going on to my next slide. Just a tad bit. I mean, the focus has really been on employers and what can this provide to hold down jobs and keep employment active. This is also does apply to self-employed taxpayers, and so although not necessarily something that I have dealt with extensively on the self-employment side, there is relief for sole proprietors to the extent of 2019 Schedule C net profit limited to the amount of $100,000, kind of correlating to the $100,000 employee wage limit for employers. The loan forgiveness is then includes all the amounts we've talked about before, with regard to other employers. It also applies to self-employed individuals, but it's this Schedule C profit amount for 2019 is prorated for 8 weeks of profit, so that it kind of correlates with the covered period discussed for other employers. Loan forgiveness is further reduced for any qualified sick or family leave for which a credit is provided under the first round of relief, which was the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. And then finally, just some thoughts on the next slide, which will talk about some of the liquidity measures that I thought would be very helpful, because PPP is not by any means the exclusive means by which Congress is trying to give taxpayers some level of liquidity. A huge opportunity for all taxpayers, and there's no this is available for all employers and also for self-employed folks as well, is the deferral of the employer's portion of the FICA taxes. The 6.2% is available. Now, the difference for those taxpayers who receive a PPP loan is that the deferral period is limited. It's limited up until the point you get a loan forgiveness decision. So that's not necessarily a short period. So if you get your loan funding, let's say in April 15th, your covered period ends sometime in around mid-June, you apply shortly thereafter, and then waiting for that 60-day decision, assuming it takes a full 60 days, your decision may not be received by you until August 9th or 10th or sometime in the middle of August. And so that could be a relatively nice deferral period. Of course, the deferral amount is subject to the $100,000 limitation as well, and cap thereof. The payroll amounts are deferred really until, and this applies for PPP loan borrowers too, even though the time period which the loan forgiveness, that's the time when you have to stop deferring. You'd have to pay your FICA taxes after the loan decision is made. You don't have to pay the deferred amounts right away. You can pay those amounts according to the normal schedule of the payment, which is 50% by the end of next year and 50% by the end of calendar year 2022. So in terms of other liquidity measures that are very attractive, the CARES Act provides us with a 5-year net operating loss carryback for years 2018, 19, and 2020. So many taxpayers have not yet filed their 2019 return yet. So there could be some opportunities with regard to accounting methods and other automatic changes that you might be able to take advantage of, and certainly planning in 2020 in order to maximize losses in 2020 in order to carry that back to more profitable years, say 2014 or 2015. And for PPP loan borrowers, I think the question that we're advising clients is on, I think you have to weigh the benefits of payroll tax deferral versus deductibility of your payroll taxes. So for example, if you are a taxpayer, whether you get a PPP loan or not, with a PPP loan recipient, your deferral period is much more limited. But you know, if you are trying to maximize your losses for a loss carry forward, payroll taxes as a liability for an accrual basis, for a cash basis taxpayer, you get to deduct that payroll tax upon payment. But for accrual basis taxpayers, you get to deduct it as late as September 15th in the following year under the recurring item exception, but which is prior to the end of 2021. So you do have a balancing act of do I get the deduction in 2020 for my payroll taxes, or do I continue to defer them according to the deferral schedule that's available to me under the CARES Act? So that's a planning point that many taxpayers will need to go through. And then finally, employee retention credits, which is another area of liquidity that Congress has given us, is not available to PPP loan borrowers. And so there are some intertwining benefits under the CARES Act that you should get with your tax advisor to see how you qualify and the limitations and how these different provisions interact with one another. And Carrie, that's what I have to provide. And thank you very much for your time and attention today.
Thanks so much, Frank. Appreciate that. I would ask our participants, our attendees on this webinar to go ahead and submit any of their questions for Frank or Neal at this point in the Q&A tab. They'll actually be visiting and looking at that Q&A tab during the next presentation, but we'll also take some of those live at the end time available. And also, just as a reminder that all the presentation here is general guidelines, and we do still recommend that if you have specific needs or questions for your company, that you do seek advice from your counsel. Now I'd like to turn things over to Jeff Sorrells with Insperity. Jeff is going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the workplace and what employers should be thinking about when they are restarting, and how to best take care of their employees. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Carrie. So let's just jump right in. I'm sure everybody is a little anxious and maybe excited about getting their employees back into the workplace. But let's just look at some HR and some safety considerations. And one of the questions that has been pretty frequent is, what are the OSHA requirements in terms of cleaning, disinfecting the workplace so that my employees can come back? Well, OSHA doesn't really defer, but they look to the experts with the Centers for Disease Control. And the three things that the CDC really focuses on is the hazard assessment of the workplace. The workplace that your employees left 4 to 6 to 8 weeks ago, even though it may look the same, it is not the same when they return. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. And because of this hazard being invisible, this virus, it is going to be key to focus on employee and worker training and changing your employees' behaviors to make it routine in regards to keeping their workspaces clean and following up with disinfecting protocols and things of that nature. So let's move to the next slide. So let's talk about some of these things in regards to cleaning and disinfecting that the CDC kind of goes over. But before we even get into that, before returning to the work site, let's look at some non-COVID considerations on the bottom left-hand corner there. Whether you lease your office space or you own your office space or whatever that may look like, and if you haven't been there for the last 6 to 8 weeks, there's some things you really need to look at just because the facility probably hasn't been used. And that could be looking at the utilities, flushing the water supplies, replacing the filters in your refrigerators, the HVAC systems. When we left back in March, it wasn't that hot. And we're supposed to reach probably 92, 93 today. Whether you're scheduled to have your HVAC system looked at in June, it would probably be a good thing to have it looked at now, have the filters clean, the ducts cleaned, especially clean out the lunch rooms, the break rooms, definitely clean out the community refrigerators. And of course, visually inspect all the interior and exterior parts of your building and office space. What's changed in the 6 or 8 weeks since you've been there? But before returning to the work site, and we'll focus on this a little bit in the next few slides, but how you clean and disinfect your work site will depend on what's kind of happened since you've left. Guidance has been given. If nobody has been there in the past 7 days or more, just a general cleaning and disinfecting will probably work. And of course, you want to go over all the surfaces, and that's part of the hazard assessment. That could be mopping the floors, you know, the stair rails, all that good stuff needs to be cleaned. But if you've had people going in and out, depending on your work environment and your industry, you may need to contract a specific, commercial cleaner to disinfect that area. But after you return to the work site, as these bullet points show here, you need to regularly clean and disinfect all objects, okay? And that just doesn't mean say we're going to do it. You've got to train your employees on how to do it, where to find the products that you're going to have, those sanitizing products and disinfecting products. Of course, you need to keep hand sanitizer available in all common areas. If there are no disinfecting wipes, just make sure that the product has at least 70% of alcohol should be used. And you might want to consider the last bullet point there, a color coding system. Maybe red means that area has to be cleaned and disinfected every hour. Green is maybe daily. You're going to have to change the behaviors of your employees. They just can't walk in and sit at their desk. Even though they may be the sole proprietor at that desk and they're not sharing it, there has to be some kind of routine. And it's not just when you're training them, and these references are in the CDC website, you just can't have your employees say, well, I sprayed it down and wiped it. If you look at that next to last bullet point, they're saying it really needs to stay on there for at least 4 minutes, and if possible, let it air dry. Obviously, if it can't air dry, they can definitely wipe it down after that length of time. So let's go to the next slide. So we keep mentioning all these things that need to be different. So what kind of communications do you need to consider and need to occur before the employees return to the workplace? Well, best advice on that is you're going to need to tell them it's going to take time. There's going to be a transition process. You need to tell them what the expectations are. Just like I said earlier, the workplace they left 6 to 8 weeks ago, even though it may look the same, it is not the same workplace they're going to return to, because we have that invisible hazard that we have to address. So if you go to the next slide, how do you want to address that? Well, you can definitely address that with OSHA's general duty clause. And you can start off, look, the work site that we are returning to is not the same one, and we're going to have to put a lot of new things in place, which is going to involve every employee, not just management, to ensure, as the clause says, the workplace is free from any recognizable hazards that are causing or likely to cause death or serious harm to employees. And if you think about it, most people are going to think about, oh, well, I knew I needed a stand-up desk. That was an ergonomic hazard, or the physical hazards were the extension cords and trip things. But think about all the new cleaners and disinfecting products you're going to have in the office now that regard chemical hazards. And then, of course, the biggest one is the virus, the biological hazard. And that is the hazard that we cannot see, like we can see normal trip hazards or bad, desk chairs. So you have to heighten their awareness, and you can start here with OSHA's general duty clause. So let's go to the next slide. And other ways that you can kind of help communicate that as well too, if you go to the CDC website on the left, there's a poster there. I'm sure we've all seen that. It's highly recommended that you put that poster in break rooms, maybe at the entrance and exits, maybe near the restrooms, so that they can remember to wash their hands, don't touch their eyes or nose, make sure that they clean regularly. You're going to have to change the employees' behaviors because the workplace is not the same as it was when they left it 2 months ago. Then, of course, OSHA has some 10 points there. You can post that poster as well. So let's go to the next slide. And like I said, these are probably the best resources that you can use. This is a very high level overview of, how to disinfect and clean the workplace, because everyone's is different. But I would highly recommend you go to OSHA and CDC, and they definitely have some good resources there. So let's go on to the next slide. So we're still in the HR safety arena a little bit. So you've communicated to the employees what to expect. You've hopefully done some, on-the-job training, on how to wash their hands, how to clean their work surfaces, where the cleaning supplies are. But what happens if you have an employee that refuses to wear a face mask or submit to those temperature checks? Well, the face mask part is, if we go back to the general duty clause, you're trying to prevent, them from being exposed to any hazards. Well, just like in machine shops, they're required to wear safety glasses. You may need to implement that for us to prevent you from contracting the virus, and to mitigate that hazard, everyone is going to have to wear a face mask of some sort, okay? It's no different than walking into a machine shop where that personal protective equipment of safety glasses is required. Now, the temperature check thing, I'm just going to say there's still a lot of debate on that. You have to make sure somebody's trained in how to properly do it. There's privacy issues. Obviously, people can be asymptomatic and not have a temperature. That's going to be on a case-by-case basis. It's really hard to make that determination on what to do there. But can work breaks be staggered to reduce crowding? Most definitely. Most definitely. If you want to be a promoter of social distancing, you need to be promoting this. And maybe you need to set specific lunch hours, where in the past anybody could eat lunch between 11:30 and 1:30. Maybe there needs to be a specific 30-minute time frame for each department to use that break room. And the last question here, how long after an employee is tested positive for the virus can they return to the workforce? Well, there's two ways to look at that. Obviously, if they've been tested, they're probably going to go back and get a test, and we've heard that they have to get 2 negative tests before they can return. But there's also, because of the limitations of testing, the symptoms-based kind of gauge point. And what the CDC says on that is the person has to be at least 3 days fever-free without any fever-reducing medicine. And the key to that is it has to be at least 10 days since they first exhibited some of those symptoms. So work with your employees. If they have, limited access to testing, you may have to go off the symptoms-based thing in allowing them to return to work. Let's go to the next slide. So this slide here is going to focus on flexibility, like the pencil at the bottom, okay? So what incentives can be offered for essential employees returning to work when other employees can work from home? There's a myriad of things. You can do gift cards to restaurants, Amazon gift cards. Maybe you might want to do a one-time bonus. Maybe you might want to give those people additional floating holidays. There are things you can do, okay, for those that have returned to work and those that can't. How should employers communicate who is an essential worker? Granted, hopefully you think everybody's an essential worker, but sometimes we have to break that definition down and what's the objective or the criteria for each position. This is probably not the best example, but maybe you're moving back into your workspace and the essential worker, you tell the shipping and receiving clerk who's on the back dock, you are essential because the product cannot go in or out of the warehouse unless you're there. Where to help practice social distancing, maybe the accounting clerk can continue to work from home to give somebody else more workspace within the office. My essential employee refuses to come back to work. Now what? Like Frank and Neal said earlier, documentation is key on these types of situations. And that documentation needs to include that this is the communication we sent out to prepare the employees to return to work. We've trained them on the disinfecting protocol and cleaning of workstations. We've told everybody that this is how we're going to mitigate that hazard. And we've offered this employee to come back to their same position, but yet they've refused to, okay? So you definitely need to keep all that documentation, but your question is, can we terminate them? My professional recommendation on that would be not to terminate them. You don't want to be the poster child in a court case. In fact, we have heard in a different arena, there are already court cases coming through the courts for people not paying the paid sick leave under the FFCRA. So the courts are looking at this situation. So once again, flexibility is key. You may need to place them on an unpaid leave of absence. What if the schools are still closed when employees need to return to work? Once again, flexibility. Have you offered them resources? Have you helped them find alternatives? Can you help them work from home? Maybe give them a laptop to work from home. Once again, flexibility is key, but you also want to theme it that this is not permanent, this is temporary, and as soon as things get better with the pandemic, we expect everybody to be back to work as soon as possible. Next slide. An employee who's tested positive for COVID previously is now having performance issues. Address the performance issue. Just because they tested positive and they went through the recovery period does not mean or allow them to come back and make mistakes. Okay, so make sure you document that appropriately. At what point can an employer test a candidate or ask about symptoms or if their start date needs to be delayed? The EEOC has come out with good guidance on that. The key to that is go through the regular interview process, quantify their job qualifications, offer them a contingency job offer, and once they accept that, then you can ask them, have you been exposed to the virus? Are you currently recovering from it? But you cannot ask any of that prior to offering them a job. And the last one here, return to work policies for furloughed or rehired employees. Do the same FFCRA benefits apply? The way you need to look at that is, I'll give you one example. Let's say an employee tests positive, they give you the documentation, and you start paying them their 80 hours of paid sick leave on, say, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. But then on Friday, you need to lay that whole employee's department off of 20 people. So you've made a business decision to lay those 20 employees off, including the one that tested positive and who's already received 24 hours of paid sick leave. You do not need to continue paying that employee their paid sick leave because technically there is no work for them because their department was laid off. So the next slide. I'm sure there's some questions that have come in, but I just wanted to share with you that if you go to Insperity.com, took a little snippet there, we do have a green ribbon across our homepage there, the COVID-19 Resource Center. A lot of what I spoke about here and a lot of other information is on there, and I would highly recommend you go out there and check it out. Carrie, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Jeff. Appreciate Jeff's time. Frank and Neal as well. We actually have run out of time, but it looks like the Q&A area has all the questions have been answered, hopefully sufficiently for our audience today. I will mention, and we'll try to get this information over to our members as well, that we do get questions about third parties coming into the workspace. So while there is the questions related to employees, that's not so much for an employee, but the third party vendor supplier, or quite frankly, what arrangements do you need to have with your building or your landlord? So I think that Jeff, if you have a second, can you pop back up and just, do you have any comments regarding the supplier or the third parties coming into your space?
Yes, thank you, Carrie. Once again, you've seen probably, I don't know if it's H-E-B or Kroger or Costco, they are requiring their customers, i.e. a third party who come into their stores, to wear masks. So if you feel you need to do the same thing, maybe you're a facility that has lots of truckers that come in and check at the shipping and receiving area, you're going to need to consider posting some kind of notice there that to enter into this area, everyone must be wearing a mask. Just like the same thing if I was a customer going to visit a machine shop, they would ask me to wear the safety glasses as well. So yes, you just need to notify your customers and third-party vendors of those expectations.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Again, we are out of time, but if you will just take a moment to respond to our poll, let us know what types of programming you'd like us to see in the future. We would greatly appreciate it. And I'll just give you a second there. While you're taking that poll, just a quick announcement. For any future events that we might be having at the Greater Houston Partnership, you can go to houston.org/events, and you can get all of our upcoming events and programming coming up. You will have received just recently a notification in your inbox from the Greater Houston Partnership. We just distributed our 16-point report or page report regarding some of our recovery task force work, and you'll want to take a look at that because that's going to actually break down restart by industry. So that's actually a really important report for you to review, and we just sent that out. So take a look. Thank you again so much for your time today. I'll leave up on the screen if you want to remain our WorkSafe principles. And again, this webinar has been recorded, so you can get all this content, including the PowerPoint presentations, later this afternoon. Jeff, Neal, and Frank, thank you so much for your time today. Appreciate it, and great information. We will see you for our next workshop. Thanks, everyone.